Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school age care sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. Children's rights, it's a key aspect of the work all of us do. It underpins all our interactions, our pedagogy and our practice. And in the first episode of this series, Professor Noreen Hayes gave an overview of children's rights to education. And in the follow-up bonus episode for the International Day of Play, we spoke more specifically about the fundamental right to play. In this episode, we're going to hear more about the idea of human rights education and the concept of global citizenship education. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Sheila Long from the Technological University of the Southeast, C2, where she is the Programme Director and Lecturer on a Professional Social Care Practice Programme. She also lectures on an undergraduate Early Childhood Education and Practice Programme and a Master's Programme in Child, Youth and Family Studies. She is specialised in the field of international children's rights education and a child rights-based approach to early childhood education. Before lecturing, she worked as a professional social care worker with babies, children and young people out of home, out of school and in the care system in both Ireland and Northern Ireland. She has also worked for over 3 years as a development worker and a technical advisor with a range of national and international NGOs in the fields of psychosocial supports, early childhood education, edutech and social policy for children and young people in East and Southern Africa, including Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda and Lesotho. So Sheila, you're really welcome.
Thanks very much, Moira.
Thanks for coming on the podcast today. So I'm really interested in hearing about your experience, about the academic work and research that you've been doing on the area of global citizenship education. But maybe you tell us first how you became interested in the area of GCE.
Thanks, Maura. I think my interest in global citizenship education started when I was about 3, so in my own early years education. And I have probably a bit of an unusual story in that I started school at age 3, just about going on to age 4. So my school would have been a very tiny 2-teacher school in the country, and starting formal education at that age could have been quite disastrous had it not been for the school and had it not have been for the principal. So the huge focus at the time was on play, project-based learning. There was a massive focus on art and drama, local history, archaeology. And my primary school teacher herself had been an early years educator. So her approach for 30, 40 years in that school was very much a play-based, holistic, informal education, which we benefited immensely from. And it was only later on when I was teaching Ashton did I really see actually the benefit of what she did in that school. And then a second interesting point that was a bit unique as well, but was related to her husband, who was overseas, had worked in the army. And so he was serving in Congo and Lebanon during her time teaching. So she also brought this very unique international perspective to us. And it was true, learning about this international perspective from her, whether it's through song or language or discussion. We learned about apartheid, we learned about racism, we learned different languages. We were exposed to French, to Swahili, to the music of Harry Belafonte, it was just a very, very global yet local education. So like I say, she role modeled every day for us what it meant to be a global citizen, which was a concern for human beings across the globe. and our own community, our own very local rural community, but also the planet, which was our common home.
Yeah, that's a great grounding, and it really shows it's something we'll come back to talk about later, is that, how it links to early years. But I suppose before, it's a term that is becoming more frequently heard, the concept of global citizenship education. Can you tell us what exactly we mean when we're using those terms? I think it's always helpful to kind of start with maybe a definition or two that, helps give us that kind of shared understanding that we know exactly what we're discussing.
Absolutely. So global citizenship education is, in more recent years, it's been used as an umbrella term, and it has encompassed multiple approaches, such as intercultural education, multicultural education, human rights education, as you mentioned earlier on, education for sustainability, and development education. So it's an umbrella term that encompasses all of those approaches, which have distinct origins, characteristics, and emphasis. But a more specific to early years definition that I would use, and I am have been teaching it in the past year, is that it's a lifelong educational process which aims to increase an early childhood educator's awareness of the rapidly changing, interdependent, and unequal world that we're living in. By challenging stereotypes and encouraging independent thinking, global citizenship education helps early childhood educators to critically explore how global justice issues interlink with their everyday personal lives and professional practice with young children, and how they can act to build a better world. So that definition really just shows that it starts with the adult. So in a lot of educational approaches, we start with the adult first. So this might be familiar from in the anti-bias approach. It's familiar from learning about children's rights, that oftentimes you start with your own, the work has to start with the adult before then we go on and do it with children. So that's why I've started with early years educators, and that's where my focus is at the moment, with working with students, and then we can also look at what that means when we're working with children. So I can go into that in a little while as well.
Yeah, I think that bit of starting with ourselves is is very important. I think I've maybe quoted before. I remember seeing a documentary on, it's a good many years ago now, where David Irvine from the North spoke about hatred being a taught process rather than a thought process. And it has really stuck in my mind ever since, that we're not born distrustful. We're not born fearing other people. It's our environment, our beliefs develop through our experiences. And I think that's why it's really important, as you say, to start with ourselves, start with the anti-bias goals for adults are so important in that regard, that you can't support the development of understanding and anti-bias in children until you've started to explore it in yourself. So can you take us through, you mentioned that you look at how it links to early years, why it's important. You've touched on it already, and you've mentioned how your own experience, but can you take us through, sometimes when you look online and you Google something like global citizenship education, it talks about older children. But, why do we need to start with the very young children in early years and moving up into school age care settings like most of our listeners would be working with?
Well, I think starting with the adults. So for me, I work on a 4-year Bachelor of Education in early childhood education and practice in Carlow for the past 12 years. So so for me, I've chosen a particular module to embed it in. So I've embedded children global citizen education in an equality, diversity, and inclusion module. And I've also invited, workshop agencies as well to come in and give a workshop. So in terms of materials in early years, what's available out there. As you rightly said, the focus has been for a number of years on initial primary education and secondary school education. So the materials and the resources over the last number of years have tended towards those spaces. There's some excellent resources available from DICE in Maynooth, in Mary I in Marino and in DCU. So there's been a lot of really, really good resources done there. And there's been some focus on the early years as well. So I think in terms of the early years, then when we're looking at the links, when we start looking at building on what we've been doing so far in early years, I think that's a really important point to make, that we're building on a very, very strong foundation when it comes to global citizen education. It sits very easily with our early years values. So, for example, our commitment to social justice, equality, human rights, children's rights, play, participatory pedagogies, our commitment to diversity, equality and inclusion, and our commitment to nature and outdoor play. So all of those very, very important foundational values of early years really, really help us to start thinking about global citizen education. And then the big issues that global citizen education has, we have to start thinking about, well, how do these really, what have they got to do with us in early years? Because like you said, we're not in a formal education space like in primary and secondary school, but we still need the confidence and skills to respond to children's questions. Even though we may never be fully prepared. So some of the questions that they may have might be related to the social world that's happening around them. So I'm just going to go back to the 1980s for a second to bring back to what was going on when I was a child, and maybe some of the listeners will remember the 1980s for us was also very scary, the social world and what was happening in the on TV at that time. What very young children were being exposed to was around nuclear proliferation. There was a lot of talk of Sellafield and acid rain. I think people might remember that. And of course, we had the famines of the 1980s in Ethiopia, so 1983, 84, 85 famines. So there was a lot of scary environmental and international conflicts going on in that as a backdrop as well. So that's no different to also the big issues that are happening around children today in terms of, increasing global inequalities, climate change, the impacts maybe of forced migration. So these are the big issues that are happening around children in their social world. And as adults, we need confidence and skills to be able to have those conversations.
And it's probably magnified now because, back in the 80s, it was, there was news was on twice a day. You didn't have that constant news stream that we have now, not to mention social media. So it's probably, coming at children maybe more than we always appreciate. And I suppose we can never underestimate how much children are absorbing that we feel they mightn't be or mightn't even be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. They're taking it in, and whether or not they're asking the questions or whether or not we're having the conversations with them. Like you say, it is being absorbed from the world around. So what strategies then can we take on board as early childhood educators? And so I'm having a bit of a think about some of these strategies, and some are effective, some maybe not so much. It depends on each and every person. how comfortable they are. So, for example, we can inform ourselves about global issues as they arise. So we have lots of global issues happening in the world around us to be alerted to, but at any one given point in time, you know, we don't know what a child might be have questions about. So you can't do too much background preparation. And also, at the moment, there's 32 global conflicts going on in the world. I mean, which one are we going to be informed about? You know, so it's a big ask for, you know, to stay informed. Another strategy is that we could attend global citizen education workshops or trainings, or source some resources for ourselves. So there's resources from NGOs, that international NGOs and national NGOs that are also being made as well, made available to earlier. So we can also source that for ourselves. I think probably what's the most important is to show solidarity with children and families in our settings. So that's where we can make the most impact, and make it as local to the settings that we work in. We can also think about decolonizing our curricula, so being a bit more intentional about the literature, maybe ensuring that we have global literature, folklore, traditional music, stuff that the sector is doing already, and just probably needs the reassurance to keep doing it, and to keep doing it really well. One of my favorite books of all time I bought from Early Childhood Ireland a few years ago, and it was called We All Went on Safari. I hope you still have it in your shop. And it's called A Child's Journey Through Tanzania, and it's a really beautifully written storybook for children. So it's just about, exposing children to the much wider world, so that they can have a curiosity about what's going on around them. The other question you raised was around maybe connecting the dots with what we already do in terms of Ashtar, Síolta, children's rights, and the SDGs and the anti-bias approach. So I think global citizen education is very much a natural progression on the work we've already been doing in anti-bias training and inequality, diversity and inclusion training in early years. And it's based on a very firm foundation on the International Children's Rights Framework as well. So it links in very, very well with Ashtar, and particularly this new revised or the new proposed revised image of the child in Ashtar of an agentic global citizen, and equally the agentic educator. So it fits in very nicely with that. Very strong links with children's rights, particularly the participation rights, but also education rights. Links in with the Lundy model, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And very strong links as well between the Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG 4, for example, it relates to quality education and quality early childhood education specifically. And within SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 4, there's also mention of global citizen education. So it's important to be aware that there is a very strong commitment at international level for global citizen education as well. And then also Sustainable Development Goal 12 is also talking about responsible consumption. So there is very strong connections there. And then I always think that the very foundational pioneers of early childhood, from Montessori to Steiner to Froebel, all had something really important to say on peace and on equality and on social justice. So we're, as always in early childhood, standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to educational approaches such as children's rights or global citizen education.
So it's very clear that this is work that has been kind of evolving rather than anything
Yeah, it's not, it's
newly invented.
absolutely not new. Yeah, it's not invented, and it's not the latest new fad or anything like that. If you think about global citizenship education, it can, you can really trace it back to Greek and Roman times, to cosmopolitanism. You can trace it back to Confucianism. You can trace it back to Ubuntu philosophy, which is an African philosophy that talks about community and interconnectedness. So it has a very, very strong connection to older philosophies. It has a very strong connection to the international human rights framework. And then in more recent years, there's been a lot of policy work from UNESCO and the UN in terms of global citizen education and sustainability as well. So there's been waves, but its latest iteration has been really coming on strong since the 90s, and it's been framed as global citizen education. So
I suppose
the next,
yeah, go on.
I was going to just say that the next point that I really wanted to make then was around our understanding in early years. We have a very strong understanding of young children as capable of being aware of the wider world and having a sense of themselves as global citizens. We know they're capable to and have a curiosity and sense of understanding of how the world works, and willingness to make it more just and sustainable. So there has been lots of research and practice, really, really good practice in early years in this field already. So like what you said, it's not a new thing to early years at all.
But there are times it's not always easy. We've it can be challenging. The discussions within staff teams, maybe encounters with parents, can be sometimes uncomfortable or challenging. And when we started, we were saying about looking within ourselves, and that's not always the easiest thing to do. Have you thoughts and suggestions on how we can, sometimes we can shy away from areas that we fear might make us uncomfortable?
Yeah, it's quite like, it can be controversial, isn't it?
Mm.
Some of the questions a child can ask, you would much prefer that they didn't ask. So it's not that um, we're going to be presenting an agenda to a child where we don't have a sense of, I want this child to know this or have this particular knowledge. It's basically you're responding to a child's interests and curiosities. But it sometimes those interests and curiosities can bring up discomfort for us rather than the child. And sometimes we can be absolutely paralyzed by, I call it paralyzed by uncertainty, where you really don't know how to respond, and you're really confused, and you're worried, and you're afraid you're going to offend, and you're afraid you're going to say the wrong thing. So teaching adults and engaging with adults first is a way for the adults to kind of critically reflect on their perspectives and critically reflect on their own beliefs before, so that they have some sense of confidence and preparation for these eventual questions. But the children can also be very aware of our attitudes and our silences too, and those can also be very strong. Those can be very strong. Those can send a very strong message too, as well, to the child. We have to be a little bit aware that these topics will always be controversial, because we're going to be talking about, the bigger issues. They're what I would call wicked problems. They're the very, very complex, not easily solved problems in the world. And as we know, the 21st century, the century we're living in is sort of going to be defined by climate change and hunger, injustice, and global inequality. So it's this is the world that children are growing up in, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think anything that challenges our values or that makes us explore our values can be can be uncomfortable. It can be a bit disconcerting, and it can make us uneasy sometimes. And then it's interesting that you mentioned the 80s and everything that was going on then, and even within Ireland that was an uncomfortable time. So these issues kind of evolve over time. But I suppose, would you agree it's about, kind of looking within ourselves and supporting children towards an understanding of, how big the world is, and, the concepts of injustice and being fair, that, and helping children to understand those ideas?
Those are the again, the core values that we work in early years. So it's I think oftentimes we worry that their questions are huge and that we have to give really, really comprehensive responses. But it might be just during playtime opportunities to have conversations around, water, recycling, nature, fairness, biodiversity. So it's not, it doesn't have to be very, very big, massive, scary conversations. We have to also be aware that we need to be age appropriate and not induce climate anxiety, or to be realistic, but also not to scare children, because it's because of the age group that we're working with. But at the same time, be aware that they're capable of, very much capable of taking on board and having solutions themselves too.
And certainly older children, settings that have school age children, they can be very aware and very conscious of fairness and justice. And, we've heard from time to time of children who have been, very proactive in fighting various injustices that, sometimes we underestimate children. We have to kind of keep reminding ourselves of that capable, competent child, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you kind of look at Ashter, and one of the principles of Ashter is really saying, the need for children to learn social and culture, to value social and cultural differences, and to recognize and challenge injustice and discrimination, and to stand up for themselves and others. So it's very much part and parcel of what we do in early childhood. It's not it's not controversial, really. It's part and parcel of what we do.
So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned about the agentic adult as well, and that aspect of the proposed updated Ashter, that encouraging educators to be agentic, and bringing their own thoughts and ideas, and having those discussions around shared values, and how we can pass those positive values on to children. So is there anything else, Sheila, that you wanted to, I know you've done a lot of work in this area lately, so is there any aspect that I've forgotten, or that you'd like to remind us of before we wrap up?
No, I would just say that there is some resources out there. There's some challenges as well. So if you're looking to source some resources, just be aware that some resources can be a little bit at odds with diversity and inclusion, human rights, and anti-bias principles. So, really critically appraise the material you're using. If you get any material to use, or resources. So to be aware of maybe a charity-based mindset, or images of sometimes it's known as the white savior complex. So just to be very sensitive to the families in your settings, because when you're talking about issues that are of global relevance, you can sometimes come across material that might be very specific to a country or a context, and you might also have children from that country or context in your setting as well. So just to be a little bit aware of the material that you're you're using. So, really check it for stereotypes, for a charity mindset, and ensure that it sort of promotes global solidarity and empathy, and just really challenges unequal power relationships. So you sort of have to be quite aware of the material that you use, if you're using materials. But oftentimes what we do in early years is on the spot, and inquiry based, it's play based, and it's going to be really about responding to children's questions in the moment. So it's a lot of the time it's about ourselves and informing ourselves in the first place.
Yeah. I think that, that's a really good point about, I suppose, proofing the materials that we have for kind of stereotypes or of any kind. I remember an educator saying one time about a childhood, and there was a person of color in the setting, and a child kept offering that person, that educator, their lunch. And it kind of dawned on them that the impression that this child had was that all people of color were starving. It's, that so often they're the materials that are presented in kind of various resources that can be available.
Myra, I'm going to finish on a hilarious story that is similar to that, but it happened to me. I have blue eyes, and when I was in Tanzania, a child came up to me and said, "Teacher Sheila, are you blind?" And I said, "No, why?" And he said, "Because you have the same color eyes as my grandmother." Because all he had ever seen of blue eyes was his grandmother, who I think might have had cataracts or something.
Okay.
So it's so funny how children can also have very, very curious questions, and how we respond is key as well.
It's key.
It's key. Yeah, it's absolutely key, and how comfortable we are with responding as well. And global citizen education helps you to be comfortable with those conversations too.
So in terms of, you've mentioned reading and the stereotyping and so on, is there any kind of goal, I suppose, before we can maybe proof an environment to make sure that there aren't stereotypes, and that we need to increase our own awareness? Is there any one resource or publication that you would suggest, something like the Anti-Bias Charter, or is there something else? Because I suppose none of us know what we don't know, and that you mightn't be aware of things that are stereotypical unless it's kind of pointed out to you, or you're supported to see something with fresh eyes.
I think there's been recent research done in 2023 by the Global Village Consortium, which is partners with Troker and DCU and a couple of other partners. So they've done a very big piece of research on global citizenship education in early childhood. So that would be a good kind of academic piece to look at. There's also research funding available. So there's oftentimes research funding available for global citizenship education. So for maybe for research orientated people, that might be something to look into. And then in terms of other resources, I think IDEA is one. So it's Irish Development Network. It's a network of development education network. That's another good place to start to look at, and to look at some codes of practice, or there's been also some material done by DOCAS. So those are some organizations that are sort of active in a more broader way than in early childhood specifically, but there's some good materials there for them, and they're Irish-based NGOs.
That's great, Sheila. Thank you so much for taking part. There's a lot to reflect on there, a lot to tease out, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
No problem at all. Thank you so much, Myra, for the opportunity.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our